Welcome to the Gestalt IT Rundown for today, May the 3rd, 2023. And if things feel a little bit spooky outside, that's because it is National Paranormal Day. I am your spooky host, Mr. Tom Hollingsworth, and joining me is the ghost with the most, Mr. Chris Grundeman. Chris, welcome to the show.
Hey, Tom. Thanks for having me on.
Well, thanks for being here. We've got a great lineup of news. We've got some interesting stuff. And we're bringing up a specter of the past in our closer look. I think you might enjoy that a little bit. We're actually going to start off with some news about Intel because they had their Q1 call last week and they gave everyone a status update on their latest client processor. It's called Meteor Lake, we think. It's their first disaggregated CPU, and that's the first one that's going to be offered on their Intel 4 process node. You may remember that is the one that is going to be offering their chiplet technologies that allows them to use different chiplet designs for I/O graphics and more instead of having to rely on one big monolithic package. In fact, Meteor Lake is really being seen as the first test of that new technology before they move it, of course, into Xeons and all of the other rapids, rivers, whatever they're going to call them this time. The funny thing is that it's been almost a year since we've heard the last status update on Meteor Lake. Last year in their Q1 2022 results, they announced that they'd powered it up for the first time, and now they're saying that they're going to be ramping production and that it should be out later this year. Chris, the question that I have is, are they going to be able to hit that deadline? Because we've seen problems with Sapphire Rapids. And will this new process node actually make sense for people? Or is this going to be another thing in a long list of stuff that didn't pan out?
Yeah, they're both really good questions, I think. You know, on the manufacturing side, this is the lead product for Intel's next generation EUV-based Intel 4 process node. So it's basically brand new manufacturing, right? It's also going to be the biggest use of the Foveros 3D die stacking technology attempted so far. And it's the first attempt to do that, the Foveros 3D die stacking on a relatively cheap mass market processor. So there's a lot of things that need to come together for the manufacturing to work out on this. We have an official launch window in the second half of the year. We'll hope for something in the third quarter as far as more concrete details. But a regular Intel client processor ramp up takes several months, even without all that new manufacturing stuff in play. So, it's going to be close, I think, at best, and we'll see how it happens. I hope they pull it off because it is really neat. This is the 14th generation of Intel's core processors, for those who are counting. And as you said, it's the first client CPU that's going to be using chiplets, which makes it the first heterogeneous chiplet at all. What do I mean by heterogeneous? It's actually using different chiplets for I/O, for the CPU cores, for the graphics, and more. So it is a really interesting architecture. Again, as you said, is that hype or not? I mean, we'll have to see. I think the proof's obviously going to be in the pudding, but it is really, really neat to think of, the chip itself, the CPU, as a modular tool. That could get really interesting in the future, right? I kind of am excited to see what could come of this in the future. So I hope they pull it off, and I hope it plays out well. In something that didn't play out very well, there's been a big mess, I guess I'll call it, at WANDisco. The company announced back in March that they could not certify their 2022 sales numbers, and that their booked revenue was significantly lower than reported. At the time, we didn't report on it because it wasn't a huge news item. We didn't really know what was going on there. However, this week, WANDisco has confirmed that a single sales rep created $15 million worth of sales that almost doubled the amount brought in by the rest of the sales team, and was all made up. This false reporting caused their stock price to soar and their CEO to believe they had captured or cornered the market. Today, that CEO and the CFO at the time have both departed, and their replacements are trying to sort through the mess. WANDisco stock trading has been halted until the situation can be resolved. Tom, one rep really caused all this?
You'd think that you wouldn't be able to make a difference in a company, but boy, this guy sure did. There's a great article from Chris Malore that we linked here in the notes. The funny thing is that you read through the article, you're like, this can't be right. Like just on the surface, take the numbers out of it. One sales rep booked, well, let's just say 150% of the numbers that your entire sales department put together. That in and of itself should have been a clue that something's not right here. And they just ran with it. The stock price shot up. Everybody was like, oh, this is great. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to put on my MBA hat for a moment. You'll notice that this looks like a clown hat because the clowns that were running the company were like, oh, yeah, we're unstoppable. We're doing this. We're doing that. It would be like if someone came out and said, I don't know, I sold 1 trillion electric cars last week. Does that sound weird to you? Like the entire addressable market for automobiles on the planet and you like quadrupled it times 100? No. What really happened is that this guy, and this is the other thing too, this guy literally made up all of the sales numbers. Like it wasn't that he inflated his total, like he doubled it to hit his number or something. They're literally all fake. And that knocked their numbers down. The original reporting said that they had made $24 million in revenue last year. That's now down to $9 million. And that is a massive impact on this. They went from we've cornered the market and we are, at 100% market penetration, which is the quote that the CEO put out literally the week before the investigation came up, to, well, that guy is now giving quotes to whoever talks to CEOs that are disgraced and have left the company. And the other thing too is, obviously the guy who took over the job, not having a good day, but they're like, well, we would really like it if you would reinstate our stock. And I'm sure that the stock market is like, we'd really like it if you would be able to certify a report telling us how much money you actually made last year. And it's curious to me that a lot of the times that we see this coming up is not because a company self-reports that they've screwed something up. It's not that the company realizes that they're doing things they're not supposed to. It's because a legally required document that impacts their shareholders has to be filed. Think about the number of times that we have uncovered information that we've shared here on the rundown because, there was a note in a 10Q, or company had to refile their, quarterly report because they screwed something up. It's almost like these companies don't have your best interest at heart. They only care about their shareholders. But that's an entire soapbox that I could spend my day on. If you're a WANDisco customer, you might be one of like 50 people now. I'm sure they have great products. They just don't have as many great products as their sales rep would have led you to believe. Speaking of great products, though, Chris, Ubuntu fans can rejoice today because Canonical has announced they have a new subscription-based Ubuntu Pro offering, and it's now available on AWS. Ubuntu Pro provides critical enterprise support out of the box, including things like security maintenance and hardening scripts. Just one click and you can run them. The idea is that you pull down the Ubuntu Pro image from the AWS Marketplace, then you launch it and it can connect you to the Ubuntu Pro Compute Service Plan that Canonical then will sell you to be able to provide all of the support and everything like that. The other thing that's important is that there's a lot of focus inside the distribution on things like federal standards like FIPS and a lot of other things. Given that, do you think that this is kind of designed for governments and other regulated industries to be able to jump on the cloud quickly, give them that quick on-ramp? And if so, how is Canonical going to make sure that people prefer to pay for Ubuntu as opposed to just downloading it for free?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think that you're right that this probably does have, the public sector right in their crosshairs, maybe financial sector as well, and being able to be compliant and have these security updates. It's really interesting. I think overall, this is super interesting to me. I know, when I first started working with open source platforms, 15, 20 years ago, really the only choice was CentOS and Red Hat. That was like the enterprise choice. Debian and anything on the APT track was all kind of, for fun and playing around with, at least from the folks I learned from. I'm sure I'm going to get some hate mail based on those statements. But, it's neat to see that Ubuntu is now at least claiming to be over 50% of Linux workloads in the public cloud and being the number one Linux for developers. Really, really awesome. It's neat to see that change. And then to see Canonical come in and add these, professional services or paid for services on top of Ubuntu is interesting, right? We haven't seen that necessarily in this scale before. And the fact that they're focusing on security really makes a lot of sense to me, right? I mean, the Red Hat model has definitely worked and we've seen that they got sold to IBM and that's, gone really well. But just repeating that would maybe not be the best choice. So seeing them really focus this from a security side. And again, it's not just the kernel and things they're securing, right? It's over 28,000 packages, right? So from Kafka to Nginx to MongoDB to Redis, PostgreSQL, a bunch of stuff is hardened through this packaging. As you mentioned, right? There's the FIPS 140-2 certified modules. There's tools for automating the CIS hardening. There's common criteria EAL2 provisioning packages. There's the DISA STIG profiles. So yeah, all those little things to work with the federal government or even state and local governments seem to be in place here, as well as just overall security. I know in my own personal experience, I've noticed that my Ubuntu distributions have started popping up in the APT when you're doing like an apt update or an apt upgrade. There's a little message that comes along and says, "Hey, you can get Canonical Pro services," which I'll be honest, I was a little annoyed by. But now after I dug into the news and saw this, it's pretty interesting, and I think it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, so I think that's it. There's also, and on top of the security stuff, there is some optimized performance. Apparently, they do have an optimized kernel with an improved boot speed. It's supposed to have better runtime performance, and then just overall advanced device support, as well as some portability. Right, they've got mirrors all over the world to avoid just full-blown internet updates. So all in all, it looks like a really well thought out program. And it's exciting to see Ubuntu kind of take this leap forward in the commercial space. Speaking of other commercial activity, way back in 2019, we reported that Apple had sued the CEO of Nuvia, Gerard Williams, claiming he had breached his contract by founding the ARM-based CPU company. Nuvia was snapped up by Qualcomm last year, but the lawsuit still lingered as Apple wanted Williams to admit that what he was accused of, admit to what he was accused of doing. At least until last week, as Apple has filed a motion to dismiss the lawsuit. There is a lot of talk that part of this reluctance stems from the lawsuit that ARM filed against Qualcomm, aiming that they have no rights to use the Nuvia technology and that all rights, all designs need to be destroyed as per the licensing breach. Tom, is Apple letting Williams off the hook? Or do they see ARM succeeding in squashing this Nuvia tech?
Apple doesn't typically call off the dogs unless they see that the sharks are going to get there first. I think it's interesting because, Apple was adamant about this. And back when Williams left Apple and went to Nuvia, I mean, the reports were, and we even reported on this when we covered the story back in 2019, the reports were that Williams wanted to develop the ARM technology that Apple now uses for the M1 and the M2 and wanted to use it to do server CPUs and data center CPUs. And that's something that Apple hasn't done for years. And so he's like, well, screw you guys. I'm going to take my stuff and go somewhere else, which wouldn't have been a problem. I mean, ultimately, if you think about it, at the end of the day, what probably would have happened is that Apple would have gladly settled for a cut of that revenue. What I think kept this lawsuit hanging on is the Qualcomm acquisition. Because Qualcomm said, oh, wait a minute, we're not just going to stick to data center. We're going to do this all across the board. We're going to use your designs to do this other stuff. And that's when ARM was like, I'm sorry, what? No, you're not. Because ARM does not want competition. ARM wants everybody that uses their stuff to kind of fit in their box. So if you think about it, and we've talked about this before, pun fully intended, they are the arms dealer for the non-Intel people. Yeah, you saw what I did there. But they've slotted everybody into their own little thing. Samsung makes mobile. Apple makes mobile and desktop. Nuvia would have made server and data center, just like AMD, just like some other companies. As soon as Qualcomm bust in the door like the Kool-Aid man and said, no, we're going to sell ARM across everything, that upsets ARM's apple cart, because now you don't have two competitors in a market, you have 3 or 4, and that is problematic. So when this happened, I think ARM was like, oh, no, license says you can't do that. And that's when Apple was like, you know what? You've got bigger fish to fry. We're going to let this one go. Because the lawsuit was never against Nuvia. It was against Gerard Williams. And so what they basically wanted him to admit was that he took designs from Apple and were using them places that he shouldn't be. Breach of contract, right? And the thing is that Williams never said he didn't do it. Williams said that the contract was not enforceable under California law. And that's the sticking point. I'm not saying I didn't do it. I'm saying you can't sue me for doing it, even if I did, because that's not legal. and it was a huge test. And we've seen this now, like non-disparagement clauses and NDAs and even non-compete agreements are about to be kind of ruled invalid under, you know, the current administration in the U.S. government. I think that ultimately what this boils down to is they're letting Williams off the hook because what Qualcomm is probably going to have to deal with from ARM. And given the fact that ARM has shown over the course of the last 6 months that they are fully willing to cut off their own nose to spite their face when it comes to making money, as we've seen with all of the IPO hijinks that have been going on and things like that, I think that what they're hoping, Apple, that is ultimately hoping, is that Qualcomm and ARM will fight it out and basically beat each other senseless, and Apple doesn't have to worry about this anymore. You know, what's a drop in the bucket of a few $1 million in the long run when Qualcomm gets kind of brought to heel after all the problems that Apple's had with them? I think that this is just Apple getting what they wanted, and they get to keep their hands clean in the whole mess. But, you know, time will tell. Speaking of which, we had a story we wanted to take a closer look at, and I especially want to thank Gina Rosenthal for sharing this wonderful article from Wired. It goes into the details behind the SolarWinds Orion supply chain hack. You may remember that one. We covered it right at the end of 2020, around Christmas time. In fact, I believe I referred to it as, and I quote, the gift that's going to keep on giving. And in fact, it will. Now, you may recall that the short and dirty version of this is that SolarWinds was compromised by Russian hackers. The software was infected and used to breach other things like the US federal government, Microsoft, Mandiant, and a bunch of other companies. Well, the article has collected a lot of the information that we already knew, but a lot of stuff that we didn't already know, and it's kind of putting together a timeline of the attack. Here's some interesting stuff that was included in the article that nobody knew about at the time. Did you know that the attacks were actually done by the Russian SVR? What's the SVR, you might ask? Well, that's their version of the CIA. You know, the one that scares people. How about the fact that the US Department of Justice detected the hack just a couple of months after it was put into production and ramped up? And they didn't tell anybody about it because they thought it was an isolated incident and they didn't realize that it could be part of a larger issue. I will tell you that the whole article is a fascinating read. I sped through it right before the rundown, and I knew as soon as I started reading it, I wanted to include it in this discussion. Here's the thing that strikes me about the whole deal. We are 2.5 years past this situation, which quite honestly at the time was earth-shattering. We still don't know for certain if we couldn't get infected by this again. All throughout the article, quotes from Mandiant researchers, quotes from Microsoft researchers, all point to the same thing. This was one of the most elegant hacks that they have ever seen, and they didn't know how you could be protected from it. Here's the question that I have, Chris. Have we learned anything from this?
Oh man, that's probably the right question. It's also maybe the worst one to answer. You know, so I think yes, I do think that there have been some things learned here, right? I think that every attack, especially one as big and publicized as this, at the very least raises some awareness for cybersecurity, and paying attention to these kind of things. I think that tying this back to a state actor, especially one tied with a country as large and on big on the global scene as Russia itself, is hopefully something that'll help people wake up a little bit and pay more attention. You know, this isn't just kids in a basement messing around with companies. And I think that acknowledging that these are very sophisticated attacks from very well-funded operators in a lot of cases, right? Not all cases, right? There still are script kiddies out there doing crazy stuff, but there is also this level of state-sponsored cyber terrorism that's going on that I think, you know, may help us approach cybersecurity from a more mature standpoint, really understanding the risks and threats that are out there. Of course, the other hand is every attack is a little bit different. And so while some lessons do transfer, you know, it's always described as a cat and mouse game or you know, however you want to call it, where the attacks keep changing. They keep, you know, they adapt and learn and find new ways to break in. We then, you know, adapt our security measures and our defensive measures to you know, fight the last attack, which is a problem that many generals have talked about, right? One of the biggest flaws that we can have is fighting the last war in this war. And so understanding that these are going to continue to update and change means a lot, I think. I'll go back on that again, though, in that, a lot of this stuff does kind of stay the same, right? A lot of these, like the basic fundamentals of how you do the attack, while the actual code may change and the actual backdoor may change and the actual, software you're exploiting may change. A lot of the ways people are doing it and even the tools they're using remain the same. Some of these tools were created by our own CIA, years ago, and are now being repurposed by other actors and coming back at us. That's not necessarily the case in this instance, but I think it's worth kind of looking at the overall scope of cybersecurity in this new world where people are trying to disrupt our economy, and the people who are doing it have money and backers and aren't just doing this for fun.
I think the thing that strikes me the most about reading through this is kind of, as you mentioned, the sameness to a lot of it. I mean, if you want to use a military kind of analogy, armies today are no different than Napoleon's army, and they're no different than Alexander the Great's army. They still have to move. They still have to eat, whether they're fighting with sarissas or arquebuses or, M4s or drones or whatever. You still have to provision those armies. That doesn't change. Well, in the same way, when you break down what the SVR was doing, they were doing the same thing that most other, we'll call them professional hackers do. They breach a system and then they stop and they wait and they look. They compromise the executives' email accounts. They, they tried to figure out what was going on and what they could do. And then they breached the build servers and then they compiled the code and they waited. And they even said, like, the Sunburst DLL, it needed very specific conditions. So systems needed to be connected to the internet to send telemetry back to SolarWinds. If they got telemetry back from Sunburst and the target looked very unappealing, they would disable Sunburst. And then if they did get a good target, like Microsoft, Mandiant, whomever, they would actually install a completely different backdoor onto the server and deactivate Sunburst so they could preserve it for the future, because they realized they had themselves a pretty elegant hack in all of this. But they still act the same. Everything shut down in June of 2020. Like, Sunburst went dark. Everything got deleted and nobody could figure out why until they interviewed the FBI. And the FBI was like, yeah, we contacted SolarWinds on that day and said, hey, we saw this thing coming out of the server. We didn't know what it was. And everyone in the room, according to the Wired report, went, you what? And they're like, well, we didn't know any better. We did what we were supposed to do. We reported the intrusion. They just didn't know that the SVR had access to SolarWinds email accounts. And what happened? Just like any other criminal, they got spooked and they shut everything down and they went with what they had. To me, that tells me that no matter how sophisticated the supply chain attacks, no matter how crazy that we get when it comes to things like Pegasus being able to do, drive-by download spyware insertion on iPhone kernels, same crap's going to happen. As soon as people get found out, they're going to start covering things up. They're going to start rolling up the operation. Now, maybe they have gotten all the information that they want. Like, okay, great. They have access to Microsoft source code so they can build better bugs in the future. That doesn't mean that we can't act against what we have right now. And to me, I think that that's the most important thing. If you look at the history of other kinds of attacks in this country, well, and I live in Oklahoma, so I can speak to this. 1995, we had a major domestic terrorist attack. That changed the way that we design buildings. Big concrete bollards everywhere. You can no longer park directly in front of a federal building. Anywhere, not just in Oklahoma, but anywhere. There's reasons for that. And they've taken that design methodology to heart. Does that mean there's never going to be another terrorist attack? No. It just means they can't use the same vector that they used the first time. And I think that that's what we're doing, is we're slamming those doors shut. Now, it doesn't mean that stupid things aren't going to happen. Remember when we reported at the end of the year last year that Samsung had one of their code signing certificates stolen? Whoops. Do you think that could be important, knowing what the SVR was able to do with that? Because that was the thing that everyone was like, this DLL is signed. It should not be infected. Oh, maybe they were able to slipstream it in with like a fake certificate or something. Mandiant proved it. They went and downloaded the latest Orion update from the internet. And when they did, they found out the DLL file in there was infected too. Also, one little thing, you know how they managed to figure out the thing where they found out how the instructions were happening? They were able to do a trace from a failed build that dumped the core memory that wasn't deleted. So because they didn't clean up after themselves properly, they were able to find the one, like, I think it was like 25 300, 3,000 lines of code in this one malicious file that showed them the build process for this. If they hadn't have found that through luck, we would never know how this was able to be pulled off. And I think that that's the other thing we have to do. If you are working in a DFIR environment, or if you're anyone who's an incident responder, you have to understand that there's literally no scrap of data that is unimportant. I think back to Sneakers. It's one of my favorite movies of all time. They dumped the guy's trash on the table. Why? Because literally no piece of information about this person is unimportant when it comes to figuring out what they need to do. And that's ultimately how they succeed. And I think that that's one of the things we have to understand, is that we live in a world now that's being so driven by data, that's being so impacted by what we can do. I mean, ChatGPT is just a giant collection of AI, right? That is acting on data that we fed it. The more data we can feed into the incident response process, the more likely we are to arrive at the right conclusions much quicker, so that we don't have someone persisting in the environment 6 months, a year, 2 years after the fact.
All good stuff. Also, just a quick shout out to Kim Zetter, the author of the Wired article. Their book is also awesome on Stuxnet, and this was really good reporting here. So
awesome. Well, that'll just about do it for this episode of The Rundown. We do have some things coming up in the next few weeks that you'll want to be aware of. The first one coming up is just in 2 weeks. We are going to be having our next edition of Mobility Field Day. That's May 17th through the 19th. You can see a list of the presenting companies as well as the delegates on the website if you go to techfieldday.com. And then just 2 weeks after that is going to be Cloud Field Day. And Stephen will be back with more great cloud-focused companies talking about all things related to microservices, Kubernetes, AWS, you name it. There's an exciting time for them. And then it's the big one, Cisco Live. We'll be back with Tech Field Day Extra. We've got lots of presentations, not just from Cisco, but from some of our other favorite partner companies. We have more information ready to go on the website. That'll be happening June 6th and 7th for our Field Day presentations. But of course, as anyone who's been involved with Cisco Live knows, that's a big week-long party out in Las Vegas. So I'll be sweating it out for you, along with some great delegates, and we'll have some great information headed your way. You can always check out the rundown in your favorite consumption form, whether you do it weekly when we publish the episodes around 12:30 Eastern time on Wednesday on YouTube. You can also check us out on podcast. It's great if you're out for a long run and you need to kind of figure out what's going on in the news. We try to help out as much as possible. And Chris, thank you very much for filling in as co-host this week. If people want to check out stuff you're doing, where can they go to learn more?
Yeah, the best place is chrisgrundeman.com. I'm also pretty active on LinkedIn these days. And if you're in the American Southwest, I will be at the first ever Albuquerque Network Operators Group tomorrow, giving a talk on automation and peering and interconnection. So if you're near the Albuquerque area, I'd love to see you there. Otherwise, chrisgrundeman.com is great.
Awesome. You can also follow us. We're at Gestalt IT. You can use the hashtag rundown if you want to bring a story to our attention like Gina did today. Otherwise, we will be back next week with more great news. Until then, take care. We will see you then.